we're going to go into the car museum. The house was interesting. It was much smaller than I thought it was going to be. We have traveled about 2.5 hours seeing a bunch of farms and cows, and we're going to take the 4-lane highway back. What I get from this is blue is Tennessee, red is Mississippi, and yellow is Ohio. There's the battlefields. Also, people in Tennessee seem to really be into brick. And this is Ken's first trip with his movie camera. It's very quiet here. Look at the architecture. This is Pittsburgh Landing. They had a lot of the battle here. And then here's the National Cemetery that they dug up. The remains of the Union soldiers, so they could be in the cemetery. Now this is the Tennessee River. They were trying to push them back to.
But I can see it.
Well, there we are. That's the landing that the boats were coming up on the Tennessee River. That's the landing that the boats were coming up on the Tennessee River to help all the other Union soldiers. This was the Hornets' Nest, the spot where the Union soldiers were trying to keep the Southern armies from getting across and into the thicket. This is a representation of what Shiloh Church looked like, which was the headquarters for the Southern Confederacy. Well, this is we're in Memphis, so it's now Beale Street. We're going to take a duck tour of Memphis. The building.
Started, then we started, yeah. Everybody took the picture and
Appears to be their equivalent of our Western Walk of Fame. They have sidewalks with little, every once in a while have a blues note. The only place where you're going to see a bunch of Elvis impersonators.
Recording Service Sun Studio. Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Charlie Rich, Roy Orbison, Carl Perkins, Billy Lee Riley, Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, Rufus. Unfortunately, his wife died before construction was complete on the house. After the Lowensteins moved out, the house became a home for young, single women looking for work in Memphis. They were trained as nurses and worked at City Hospital, back where Forest Park is now. You'll see what's called a mansard roof tower. The gentleman who owned that house had that tower installed so that he could stand up there and see all the way out to the waterfront here at Memphis to watch his boats come into port, because his house was the tallest building in the city at the time. The Massey House, I'm pretty sure, was never the tallest building in Memphis. And the Mallory Neely House was built in 1852 for an insurance executive who sold it to the Mallory family in the 1880s for $45,000. Converted to today's currency, he would have paid close to $10 million for that house. The last resident of the Mallory Neely house was named Daisy Neely Mallory. She was 12 years old when her father bought the house, and she lived there for 86 years until her death at the age of 98 in 1969. She left the Mallory Neely house to the city in her will under the condition they turn it into a museum. But the Mallory Neely house is temporarily closed, and the Woodruff Fontaine house is open for tours 5 days a week. And this is Memphis's busiest babysitting service, the Juvenile Court.
And they've even got their old accounting books. We were going to get something to eat at Pat O'Brien's in Memphis. And it's very, very pretty. Okay, so we're going to try their gumbo. This is alligator and crawfish. And we're going to try their world famous bread pudding with their bourbon sauce on it. To the Pink Palace Museum. It's pretty nice. They have a lot of old stuff from Memphis. And they have added on wings and an IMAX theater. There were very few people in it today.
those fewer of you who were awake during the talk may recall that I mentioned that the state of Kentucky at the beginning of the war was literally hung up between the North and the South. And both the Confederacy and the federal government recognized how important Kentucky was. It would shift from the Ohio River to the Tennessee River because there's no other natural terrain feature between the Ohio and Tennessee that would have been useful, which is why when the Confederates were driven out, they had to retreat all the way south of the Tennessee River. We'll talk about that later. But the important thing to bear in mind is Kentucky in the Confederacy is very difficult, presents a very difficult problem for the Union. And the man who was aware of that, perhaps more than anyone else, was Abraham Lincoln. And as President Lincoln indicated last night, that was one of the reasons why, probably the major reason why he was so careful in dealing with the issue of slavery at the beginning of the war, to undermine it. They sent money to their supporters in the state. They sent military supplies to them. They established recruiting camps along the boundary between Kentucky and Tennessee so that pro-Confederate Kentuckians could go south of the boundary into Tennessee and join the Confederate Army. The federal government established recruiting camps along the Ohio River, and eventually a few in Kentucky on the grounds that they were the equivalent of Kentucky National Guard. And everybody was just walking on eggshells because of the importance of Kentucky. And it was at that time that Davis decided that he would send Leonidas Polk out to take command of the Confederate forces in the Mississippi Valley. Polk's mission was to close the Mississippi River to Union naval power. And the great fear that the Confederates had was that Union naval power based in Cairo and St. Louis and Carondelet and some of the other cities along the Mississippi and the Ohio would be used to come down the Mississippi from Cairo on down into the heart of the Confederacy. And it was Polk's job, until Sidney Johnston got there, to stop that. Polk had several possible options, several possible ways to do it that I'm going to talk about in a little detail in the next talk that I give on the boat. But the key one was to use heavy artillery to fire from the banks of the river at vessels in the river. The problem for that was that if you did that, you wanted to be able to hit those vessels in such a way that you could inflict severe damage on them. Most 19th century warships were very well protected along the sides, even the wood ones. That's where the protection was the greatest. The weakest part of a 19th century warship was the deck, the top of the ship. Because if you're in 1860, you're not expecting to be attacked from the air. The Wright brothers are not there yet. They're not going to attack you from the air. So that was the weakest part. Confederates wanted to use artillery, but to use it in such a way that it would fire down on enemy vessels. It's called plunging fire. You want to get a plunging fire from the cannon up here down onto the top of a vessel in the river, because that's the weakest part. As I mentioned very briefly at the end of the talk, the difficulty the Confederates had was getting guns big enough to do severe damage to these vessels into position where they could be used to give a plunging fire. The Confederacy had a surprising number of very large artillery pieces. They were classified mostly, which the Confederates didn't have the capability of doing. You needed a railroad. If you recall, I mentioned this at the very end of the talk this morning. The ideal place for the Confederates to defend the river, two things: a railroad to the river and high ground. And there weren't many places where that was available. In Polk's department that he had to worry about, there was high ground and a railroad at Memphis. You may have noticed on the side of the river at Memphis where the city is, there were bluffs there. And some of them at the time of the Civil War were 75, 80, 100 feet high. and the Confederates could put guns up there, and did. There was no other place north of Memphis until you got here in Columbus, where a railroad came to the river and where there was high ground. There were some places between here and Memphis where there was high ground, but no railroad. Confederates had big guns because the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army had military posts in the southern states before the Civil War, late August, that the Federals were beginning to plot to seize Columbus. Whether this is accurate or not, I don't know. Maybe John does. But he was convinced that they were planning to seize Columbus. And he reasoned that military necessity dictated that he act first. The Federals themselves were surprisingly cautious about this place. I actually have an account of a Union boat that ventured down the Mississippi River as far as this area, very, very early in the war. It was fired at from secessionists on the Missouri side of the river. It was fired at from secessionists on the Confederate side of the river, and the Federal boat fired back at the Confederates in Missouri. It did not fire at the Confederates in Kentucky, because they were under very strict orders to leave this state alone. But Polk, encouraged perhaps by his subordinate Gideon J. Pillow, and you will hear more about Pillow at Fort Donelson, where he committed one of the most despicable acts of the Civil War. But Pillow sort of the little evil, who's the guy in Dilbert who sits up here and is always telling Dogbert. Pillow, think of Pillow as Dogbert. He's sitting up here on Polk's shoulders. Take Columbus, take Columbus, take Columbus. And Polk finally decides he's going to do it. So in early September 1864, Polk sent his army marching north up the Mobile and Ohio Railroad into Kentucky for the purpose of occupying Columbus. Preceded by cavalry, infantry following by rail. They came up and they seized Columbus. This set off a sheer panic among Confederates. The governor of Tennessee, a man with the unlikely name of Isham Harris, his first name was Isham, I-S-H-A-M. Isham Harris, the governor of Tennessee, just freaked out when he heard this. And he sent an urgent message to the Confederate government in Richmond. Tell Polk to get out of Kentucky, because Harris knew that if Kentucky committed itself to the Union, that would expose the northern frontier of Tennessee to a federal attack, to a federal invasion. The pro-Confederate governor of Kentucky, a man named Beriah Magoffin, also communicated with the Confederate governors. This is a huge mistake. He said, here the Confederates are, they have violated the neutrality of our state. And the Confederate Secretary of War, Leroy Walker, sent a telegram to Polk, get out of Kentucky. Polk sent a telegram to President Davis, who was a friend of his, saying, I had to seize Kentucky lest the enemy do so. And Davis acquiesced. So military necessity justifies what you have done. Seized Paducah. Was he violating Kentucky neutrality? Oh no, said Grant, Kentucky has been invaded. We have come to defend the state against the Confederates. And the Kentucky legislature then passed an ordinance saying Kentucky is loyal to the Union. And from that time on, the only way the Confederates were going to get Kentucky would be if the Confederate Army could come into Kentucky and stay there. And as we'll see as we go along talking about this, it was impossible for the Confederate Army to do that. One other thing here. There were maybe 30% or so of the whites in Kentucky who favored the Confederacy. A lot of them, the younger ones, left the state, went into Tennessee, joined the Confederate Army. One of the people, I don't know if you're in the group here, not, has an ancestor who was in the Kentucky Orphan Brigade in the Confederate Army during the war. They were said to be orphans because they were away from their mother, Kentucky. In one of the battles, one of the generals saw them taking heavy casualties and compared them to orphans. But the younger Kentuckians who were pro-Confederate went off to join the Confederate Army. Some of the older ones stayed in Kentucky, organized a kind of rough pro-Confederate group. They met in Kentucky, Russellville, late in 1861, and they adopted an ordinance of secession, proclaimed themselves the government of Kentucky, and adopted an ordinance of secession. They applied to join the Confederacy. They were accepted and are on the Confederate flag, which is why, if you count the stars there, there are 13, although only 11 states went through the procedure of secession, which they thought took them out of the Union. But Kentucky and Missouri came into the Confederacy through that route. And it's very significant because they were two of the most populous of the slave states. In their representation, they had about 25 or 30% of the representation in the Confederate House of Representatives because their population was so large relative to that of Arkansas or Mississippi or Florida or one of those states. Consequently, these states that were not really in the Confederacy and that were occupied by Union soldiers from the beginning of the war had a major voice in the Confederate government, which offset a lot of the voices in the government from states in the Deep South. And it produced a disjointed Confederate military strategy with great emphasis on occupying Kentucky, liberate Missouri. And Confederate generals who should have been concerned with how do we hold on to what we've got were finding themselves being forced by political pressure to try to get something that we've never really had.
He was talking about the different guns that they have, and you can see this is a Parrott 5-pounder, which means it didn't weigh 5 pounds, but it used 5-pound ammunition. This talks about the cannon that we're going to look at. That in 1998, an individual found the exact location of it by using a magnometer, and then the Kentucky State Archaeological Office recovered this cannon. It must have been one heck of a cleanup. This is like a lookout from this area.
Of my life.
Well, we're starting our tour of Paducah. Well, we're starting into the Amesmore Museum. In Kentucky. We're not in Paducah, we've left Paducah.
When you step inside, you will see this is not like most museums. You will get to have a close-up look at all the fixings and furniture. I must ask that you please do not touch, lean upon, or sit upon the fixings and furniture, and no photographs are allowed inside. You can make them out here. No photographs are allowed inside the house. My name is Ruby, and if you are ready, we will step inside. We will be entering the front hall as we go in. If everyone is ready, we will just enter.
There's a cabin that later became a gun shop at Adsmore. And we found out that Adsmore was named not for any family member, but because they kept on adding on to the house. So a relative said to them, call it Adsmore. And this was the Adsmore house. Then we had a really nice tour up, and the docent was explaining that the last living relative started about 8 years before her death to know that she was going to give this place to them, and the Library Association owns it. And she wrapped, in the attic, she wrapped things in trunks and then in tobacco leaves, and tobacco leaves keep things from getting very, keeps them dry, and explained all of the dresses, what was worn and everything else. Many presidents came here. So it was very interesting. Also, what was very interesting was the fact that They didn't have closets in those days because the way they taxed people on their homes was how many doorways they had. So that's why they would have dressing screens and chiffon because they didn't want the extra doorways to be taxed. So see, we always are looking at what it's costing us to live. There's another view of Adsmore. And they sure had some beautiful patios. 2 families lived in this place, and the way they designed it, the parents lived downstairs and then the other family members lived upstairs. I don't know if you can see this, but from where I am, when I see it, you truly can see a difference between the Mississippi and the other river as to the Ohio River as it relates to the dirt.
Need to be able to walk about 7 to 10 blocks. Is that okay with everybody that's listening to me right now? We will walk slowly. We do stop and let you get a little rest in the shade, but Paducah stuff is a little bit strung out, and we have to walk that many blocks to be able to get. I want you to look at that little piece of water with that little funny thing with the 2 little squares on it. You notice this is Paducah, a bird's eye view of 1873. This is downtown Paducah, and right down here is the waterfront where you all are docked right now. Right over there where you see that little funny looking thing, that's what remained of Fort Anderson in 1873. Now Fort Anderson was over there where that big tall gray building is, and that's the highest point in Paducah on the river. So they would always build these things where they were on an elevated area so they could see up and down both ways of the river. That's a curve right there. As you all, are you going to be going that way, going away from Paducah, this way? We're going to Elizabeth now. That way, I think. But you probably saw how the river curved when you came around there. That's a good strategic point. If you can see what's coming and going, you're much better prepared for an enemy attack than if you're just on the river and you can only see one direction. So the funny thing about this fort was it really didn't start off to be a fort. We had a U.S. hospital. Now U.S. hospitals were located up and down the river, and they were mainly for the rivermen that traveled on the boats, and they were a way like for hospitals for these rivermen to get off and then the boat could keep going. It didn't slow down the river traffic. And they had these all up and down rivers. I mean, there's some up north that they're restoring now, you know, as actual historic landmarks. Unfortunately, ours was right where the fort was, right here, if you know, on the corner of the picture right here where that fort is. It was right in the center of where that fort is. And when the Civil War started to break out, since it was federal property, and they didn't know if Kentucky was going to be a neutral, a northern or southern state, what they ended up doing was building a protective wall around the U.S. property, which was the U.S. hospital. But it suspiciously looks like a fort to me, because if you look at the other star-shaped forts in the Civil War, this is very similar. And even though we only see 2 corners of it in this picture, you know, when the hospital burned down, they virtually had a regular fort. They didn't have a protective wall going around the hospital. They had a fort. And it was just right at the right place where they needed it. That's where they had that hospital. So when the Civil War broke out, we had the federal hospital, and we had that little thing built around it that would later become Fort Anderson. Okay? Now Fort Anderson was named after the Anderson family. Robert Anderson was the defender of Fort Sumter. Of course, we all know what happened at Fort Sumter, I'm sure. That's pretty well where the Civil War got kicked off to a grand start. Now I'd like to tell you that when you fail in Kentucky, you don't fail miserably, you fail well. Because Mr. Anderson lost Fort Sumter and raised himself up 2 notches in rank after he lost the fort. Because they thought he did such a fine job of losing it with gallantry. You'll be able to look at this mural for just a minute with me. Y'all can come on down. You're not going to be able to see unless you come on down because you're kind of standing behind everybody. Can y'all see? Do you want to walk around where you see a little better? Okay, this is what Fort Anderson looked like in its heyday. And we have some things surrounding this picture that I'm going to talk about. We have 3 timelines in Paducah. And when you leave off this tour, I want you to know these 3 timelines because you may have a pop quiz at the end of this tale. You just never know, you know. But we had the invasion of Paducah that happened September the 6th, 1861. That's when General Grant arrived with 5,000 federal troops, kind of unexpectedly. We were kind of expecting them, but didn't know when they were going to show up. But when they showed up, we were not expecting them. So much for Homeland Security. But we had all of the Confederate flags flying down on Broadway because we were mostly Confederate and sympathy in Paducah. We were about 75% pro-Confederate, about 25% neutral or pro-Federal. We had the wrong flags flying when the Federals crossed the pontoon bridge and came right into Paducah almost unknown and undetected. In fact, they were coming up the ramp right down there where we were at before anybody really knew they were even here. And if you can imagine not having this wonderful flood wall and hearing this tramping noise coming, getting louder, and then you see people's heads coming up over that hill, and then the shoulders, and then they've got their weapons with the bayonets attached, and you just see, you know, rank after rank after rank, you know, probably 20 abreast coming up that hill. It would be a pretty terrifying sight if you weren't prepared. I mean, how can you be prepared for a, you know, invasion anyway? And General Grant was just a little ways up the river at Cairo, and that's where he came from. And he brought 3 boats, and he put everybody off over there on the Illinois side, and then he let them walk, you know, where they'd be quiet, you know, and they'd walk, you know, and you wouldn't hear them. And then when they got on that bridge and they're coming, it's too late. We can't do anything about it. There were 2 little boys that were fishing down there at the foot of Broadway, and they saw these guys when they started across the bridge, and they peeled out like scared hound dogs, and they're yelling, the Yankees are coming, the Yankees are coming, you know. Well, they were running so fast that the people who heard them said, what did he say? What did he say? And they were already gone. They were half a mile up the road, you know. And so nobody really knew what the kids were saying. They thought they caught a big catfish or something. And we've done that, and there's a few dead ones that float down there sometimes, and I'm glad there's not one down there for you all today, because they could be rather unpleasant this time of year. But anyway, all these people, when they noticed that it was actually Federal soldiers, they started kind of running in consternation, not knowing what they should do. And this was started over 10 years ago to record our history on our flood wall. And yes, the water gets up to the back side of this wall from time to time. And this is a result of the 1937 flood. This wall was built as a result of the flood of 1937. And our river was 7 miles wide during that flood of 1937. Now, you think that's not enough water? That's a lot of water. If you don't get baptized during that kind of a flood, you're not trying to get your feet wet. And we decided that if we had people who would submit ideas for this flood wall, it would beautify our flood wall and make another purpose for it besides just protecting us from floods. And you can submit your idea to the Paducah Wall-to-Wall Board, and if it is approved, you'll pay anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000 to have your idea painted on this wall. Now, we did have a man who had kind of strange taste in Paducah history, and he researched, excuse me for saying this, Paducah whorehouses, houses of ill repute, ladies of the evening. You know, it was kind of a sad thing for a man to spend his time researching something that's still going on today. I can think of a lot more fun ways to conduct research than looking through books at dusty whorehouses.
Oh, I would sit right down in that field.
don't have any money left, and you say, I've shot my wad, I need to go home. You know, well, that is a Civil War term. And when you had a weapon, would you mind to hold that for me? When you had a weapon in the Civil War, and I had a Marine on my tour one time, and he explained to me the difference in a gun and a weapon. So I say weapon now, because we're not going to talk about guns, okay? But if you had a weapon that you had to put the powder and the little shell down in there, you know, the little ball, mini ball, and then you had to ram it down, you know, and pull it up, and oh, by the way, you had to put that thing back on the side of the gun, and then pull it up and shoot, you shot your wad. You're a sitting duck now, because you got to go through all this again, and a good infantry like that guy probably did outside the museum door up there where I found my... That's not, see, I'm supposed to look after your well-being while looking like this whole in there. So I'm going to... If you have a problem with your Dr. Schultz for me, I can help you on that. I can. You can. Oh, this is Jimmy. He has been so...
Hole in the Rock. We were supposed to be in Elizabethtown, but because of the changes that have occurred, they didn't have a plan in Elizabethtown as to how, if there was any kind of a problem, they could get off. So now we are in Hole in the Rock, which is very close to Elizabethtown. And now we're on the Ohio River.
Good morning. Either bus.
Looks like we've got some colonial ladies who are going to greet everybody.
It's a nice little...
Garden of the Gods in the Shawnee National Forest. So this is one of the grouping of rocks. Yeah. Okay. Here we go, okay. Something, isn't it? Okay, now we're going to be looking at Cave in the Rock. We're going to go down a bunch of steps for Cave in the Rock, but I think this rock formation is really interesting. This is the Ohio River. It's pretty big and pretty fast.
Right.
That was an ice house that was built to look like this table.
And that was funny. They were faking people out.
Formed in the New Madrid earthquake in 1811. My people own this cave and 5 acres of land here. This was in the early 1900s. Back in the 60s, when there was someone chasing someone else, they skin up a pole, pull that pole up in that secret room, and they had cots up there. But in the last few years, they found that there was air that was bad in that secret room. And they were afraid that somebody would get up there and die and nobody would know it. So they sealed it over, and you can't even see where the concrete is.
Oh.
Can't see what is it?
The concrete.
You can't tell the concrete from the natural rock. Oh, a bath. Is that a bath? Yeah. Yeah, there are baths, but they won't hurt you. They're afraid of us. We are there. Back on the right was it?
Hush, children.
Back on the right was a secret passage that went to Shawnee Town, which is like 20 some odd miles around that way from us. But they sealed that off too, so we don't see that anymore. Back in the very early 1900s, this great uncle of mine that owned this put a wooden floor back there where you all have gone. And he put a wooden board fence up here at the opening of the cave with a gate. We didn't have movies or TV or anything like that back then for entertainment. So they came down here on Saturday night, paid a nickel apiece to get in this cave, come back here, and they had dances. And the local people provided the music. The uncle made violins, and he played the violin. My grandfather also played the fiddle. Grandfather was a riverman. I guess that's where I get my river business. He owned a ferry down here where the ferry is today and the one at Elizabethtown. He also brought the mail in the early days in Hardin County. Everything that was brought to Hardin County came by this river, and it was a beautiful Ohio River then. When I was a child, of course that wasn't early 1900s, but when I was a child, I can remember you could get out there in that river on the boat and see those fish swimming. The water was so pretty and clear. Well, it isn't that way anymore. But grandfather built 2 boats in his cave. And I have pictures to prove that. And it's almost unbelievable that a man could build a boat right out there at the beginning of that cave. And it probably held 20 passengers, people. This uncle built a house up on that side where you came down the walk. That's called Flagpole Hill today. There was a flagpole up there at one time. When he was building that house, he spaded up a garden. And in that garden, he found a rock idol. It looked like a little old man in a squatting position. It was 6 inches tall, 4 inches wide, and it weighed 2 pounds, 6 ounces. So they thought that maybe it was an idol that prehistoric people made. Well, then came the Indians. The Indians set up camp in here and did things they shouldn't have done, probably. Well, the people over across the river wanted to get rid of those Indians. So there were about 50 Indians in the cave and 100 of the white people. Well, white people came over and they thought they were going to get them. They ran them out of the cave and killed some of the Indians, but the Indians wouldn't take that. So they picked up driftwood and made a fire in the front of this cave. And the white people that were in here, they suffocated. The ones that wanted to get out or tried to get out, they killed when they went out. All but one man. And this one man said, they told this one man, "Woe be to you who cause us to pick up our hatchet again." They had a counterfeiting deal. And there was a man named Austin, and a man named Duff, and a man named Sturtevant, I believe. And they made counterfeit money. There were plates found in this cave when I think the WPA dug out. As somebody said a while ago, when the river came up, it left the dirt in here. We have the dams now to control that. But I don't know what happened to the counterfeit plates. I don't know what happened to the idol that this man had. After that were the pirates. Are you all afraid of pirates? Somebody needs to watch my time. Okay.
We're at 11:10.
What time are you supposed to get them back to the boat?
Supposed to be at the boat at 12 noon.
What time is it? It's
11:10.
Oh, well, we got time. I'll digress here just a little bit. The movie How the West Was Won was filmed here, and somebody just said a while ago that it showed the cave hole. Well, there wasn't much that was the real cave hole. They went in Kentucky and made a model of this cave hole, and that's where most of it was shot. It took 8 days here in the county to make 15 minutes of that movie. Then Davy Crockett in the catapult race with Fester Parker was filmed here. I don't want to read you a fun. Sometimes we like to laugh. Am I right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is a Missouri mother, and she's writing to her Missouri son. Dear son, I'm writing this slow because I know
Yes. Oh, you betcha. Those dial ones. Yeah. Try it. Show its teeth. Yeah.
Now what the lady was saying was that her grandfather owned this cave, and he put a wood floor down here for people to, during the summer, come and dance. And you can hear the bats. This is a big cave. There's Ken doing his thing. So this is Cave in the Rock. Ladies at Cave in Rock to join us. Now that we're finished and we're going on board the boat.
A serious problem. The reason they thought that went back to the experience on the Mississippi River. Before about 1880, there was an enormous sandbar at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So great, in fact, that it was very difficult to get any sort of sizable ship into the Mississippi River. And a lot of the trade that New Orleans had, the ocean trade, actually went in and out of Lake Pontchartrain, not up and down the Mississippi River, because of that sandbar. And it was not unusual for a large ship trying to get to New Orleans to wait.
She twisted up her hair so tight she could not shut her mouth. Take your time, Miss Lucy. Take your time, Miss Lucy Long. Take your time, Miss Lucy. Take your time, Miss Lucy Long. I come down before you to sing my little song. I'll make it on the banjo. My name is Lucy Long. Take your time, Miss Lucy.
Knoxville area. And it's an easy instrument to get a sound out of, let me tell you. All you got is one string, so you just put it up to your mouth like so. And you just change the shape of your mouth, which looks very ridiculous, I admit. You just do a lot of making faces, and you get a sound. It's a very, very old instrument, probably came from Africa, and Dave's going to play bones and mandolin.
Not at the same time.
That's right.
Okay, okay, here we go. Well, lay down, boys, take a little nap. Lay down, boys, and take a little nap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. 17 miles from Cumberland Gap. First white man in Cumberland Gap. First white man in Cumberland Gap. First white man in Cumberland Gap's old Doc Walker, an English chap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. 17 miles from Cumberland Gap.
Going into the locks. Yeah. Well, we're in the locks. Tying us to a certain portion of the locks. I guess that's to let us know when we get high enough. Okay, it looks like what they're doing is tying us to the side as we go up. This is where we're going to be coming out. I don't know if you can see this, but we're going up. If you take a look at the comparison. Seeing the lines on the locks. Well, now we're starting to rise up to where we need to be on this side. Up there. We're in historic Collinsville.
A Methodist minister, the Reverend Ewan Weekly. In 1906, he was born here. The fella out in the Wildlife Center is my husband, Glenn Weekly. We started this facility in the early 70s after I was a 5th grade school teacher. Hi there, Gary.
How are you today?
Good. I had 10 students who couldn't read at 1st grade level. I couldn't teach them to read, but I could open their eyes to history and the world and exciting things. So the first building we brought in was this little house down here in the 1840s. where half of you will stop initially, and then all of you will see it eventually. And I thought that was it. And over 32 years, we now have 18 restored buildings. We have different eras, from the 1840s through the 1870s. All the furnishings are authentic. I think you'll be amazed at the rarity of some of them. And I wish I could stay with all of you right now, but I have to be, I'm the spinner and the weaver out here. Chanel will divide you in half. But as we go through this building, I'll show you a Maxwell House 1879 luncheon menu. It was a Christmas Day menu. And it's a collector's item, and I have one for all the ladies. I don't ever do this, but you all are just so special this morning. I just feel the need to give you something.
This is a good bus.
I can
because
tell.
I got them lost.
You didn't, Gary. That's awful.
They didn't kill me or anything. They tried to, but I hid.
See, they're going to get some special attention here, so that's all right. So when you get ready to leave, so you won't have to carry this around, be sure and stop back by, and you may want to frame this. It's the founders of Maxwell House Coffee. It was the Maxwell House Hotel, and when I was a young girl, not too long ago, the Maxwell House was there, and I attended a 4-H Congress. So that Maxwell House is a little close to my heart. So let's go through.
Can we come back and get one?
We're coming back to here, right?
Yeah.
Put your hands out. It's supposed to be a 2-room place. Where's the second room?
There's some postcards.
Well,
Well, we're going to go on a hayride.
Last time we were out here, it was so unbearably hot that I thought I was going to melt before. You didn't even want to go on the hayride. You didn't want to set the hay with you. I'll tell you how bad my singing is. When I was in high school, I sang in the church choir, and they asked me not to sing out loud.
The cars right next to the historic buildings.
These ladies aren't going to walk too far on these dresses.
Yeah, that's true.
But people are so nice here. These are all just volunteers.
Yeah.
They call them and say a group's coming in, and they just come out.
Stop. Yeah, they were disappointed.
Yeah, we're
school kids, but we hope that you'll learn something about Tennessee agriculture and our history here. Now, when the settlers first came here, they didn't have any, there were no buildings here, so they would have had to gone out into the woods and drag the wood out and hewed it off, made the notches, and then have to chink in between each one. So the first thing they would have built would have been their house. And then as they got their crops out and would have to harvest those, and one of their main crops would have been corn, they would have built a corn crib so that they could put it in there. So if you can imagine this big field out here and all that's corn, of course they didn't have big combines, you know, like we do today. They had to hand pick all of that, and the children would have been a big help there. They would have put it on a wagon like this one here, and then unloaded it in here until they were ready to use it for feeding purposes or for their food. If you'll notice on the wall hanging there is a big iron kettle. They would have used that out in the yard, built a big fire to heat their water for washing their clothes or their dishes or for baths. Or when they killed hogs, they would render their lard down in there and make their hominy and also their lye soap. You'll notice up here at the top, that's called a sickle or a scythe, and that's what they would have used to harvest their wheat and their hay. So you can imagine how long it would have taken them to cut down a whole field and then have to rake it up and then to get it in. So there again, the children would have to help on that too. So if you'll come on around this way then, get their corn out and get it off of the cob, and you can see that doesn't come off very easy. So in 1850, a man by the name of E.T. Patch from Clarksville, Tennessee, invented the first corn sheller, and it's called the Black Hawk corn sheller. So in thinking of what he could do to get this off to make the job easier, help lessen their chores, he thought, well, you know, we eat corn, we get it off with our teeth, so if I can invent something with really strong teeth. And so if you'll notice, this wheel has teeth all the way around it, so that when you put your corn in there like this, you see how fast that is coming off. It still takes a little time and a little effort, but it's so much better than having to do it by hand. And then when all of the corn is off, it brings you the cob back up. So
it was a Mr. Collins who lived out on the road about where the store is out there now, if you noticed it as you came in. And he had a post office in his home, so it was called Collinsville. And if you've heard all this, just nod and we'll skip on to something else. But I think the background to me is interesting. There was also a Colliersville in West Tennessee near Memphis, and the mail begun to get mixed up. So they changed the name of this to Southside. So it's still the Southside community in Montgomery County. Now, do you know about this that's called Historic Collinsville? Okay, well, we have to get that for you to understand the background of things. Okay, Mrs. Weekly was a school teacher, and she realized, and she loved the old things that our ancestors used. She realized that her students understood better when they saw something that she would carry to school to show them. So she decided, she got so many things that she couldn't really store them in one house. So she decided that they would start something. So she and her husband took 40 acres of their farm here and created Historic Collinsville. Now, all the houses that you see today were built somewhere else, lived in by different families, and then was moved here and restored to create Historic Collinsville. And to me, that's just real interesting the way it started. There are other houses you'll probably see on the way that have not been completely restored, and they are in the process. It takes a lot of time, effort, and money to get it restored. And then, as some of you notice, the plank right there is a little less than tight. There is always repair and upkeep, and all. I mean, it's a big job. We need a full-time maintenance person, or 2 or 3 probably. Okay, this house is the first house that Ms. Weekly obtained in creating her project. This house was built in 1842 by the Lewis family, and our present Montgomery County Sheriff is a descendant of the Lewis family that lived in this house. The house was originally built as a one-room house with the upstairs. Of course, the children slept upstairs, and everything else was in this one room. Now, I'll let you all come in. Now, do you need to sit, or are you okay standing? If it's only the time I need to sit.
Well, you'll probably be about 10 minutes, or they'll be able to get you. About 10 more minutes.
Okay.
I can
sit on the steps or something.
Okay, and if do you need to sit? If you sit that box, if it's not too low, if you get up, it will hold us, all right, but we move that little shoe thing. Okay. Remember, the important thing to remember that back in which would light and burn and give you a pretty good light. Now, do we have whales in this area?
No.
No. So we had to use some other kind of fat, and we used whatever they had. And bears were plentiful here. So they used bear grease some. Now, they liked the bears for their fur. It made a wonderful rug.
The way this thing works, you can tell the top floor was where the kids slept, and it sure doesn't look like there was much ventilation. At least this cabin had a window up there, because I can imagine it could get really hot. Got some beautiful cars put together here. This is definitely the Wildlife Center. Okay, so here's the tobacco barn. There's no chinking in the tobacco barn. It's because they had to smoke all the tobacco. This is the balloon house. Schiffer of.
As soon as that group gets up here, yeah, there's not much good reading, and we're gonna do the rundown on all of this up here on the hill. Yeah,
That's the other part of your group.
This is the 1870s. A couple of big cabins here. You can see the different mantle. There's a cast iron stove.
All right.
I like that big.
Are we ready? Okay. Have a seat. Go to the front if you.
Open areas. See, we've got a big back porch, just
It's
like
called
the
what now?
dog trot. The dogs could trot on here, lay down and take a nap, and through the breezeways upstairs and downstairs.
They call those houses, all of, a lot of them that?
Dog trot. That's what this area called this type of house.
Okay, so this is the dog trot house. More like a ranch style. Tell this was the kitchen, which nobody wanted to have near the living quarters.
You put the baby in here, and you know the rocking motion that all babies make. Pretty soon it was scooting around all over. Now the important part of this is the fact that it came from Sarah Hale's estate. She wrote, "Mary had a little lamb." And this was found up in her attic on the 3rd floor, way back in a corner. So we feel so lucky. I bet this is the only one you'll ever see.
And it's a baby tender.
She had a little tender too.
Yeah, she had a little.
This is the upstairs, the little girls' room, where they were telling us they divided up the cabin, so boys were on one side and girls were on the other.
This
I
is
bet
the
you they
girls.
had a lot of them sleeping in one
They
bed.
had it good up here, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, I guess they were pampered compared to the boys.
There probably was 6 of them.
Yes. All slept in the one bed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, they had their own chamber pot and everything.
Cool, man. Ring the dinner bell.
Big village. Yeah, we were going through Old Hickory and checking out the places, and what we're impressed with is how few have fences. Now we're heading on to another adventure. We are at historic Manskers Station. And this is a beautiful quilt. And we know the station is relatively new because it was dead. Okay, well now we're going to go see Manskers Station.
Made it.
Hello.
Mainly used for the defense. They could pull the people in the blockhouses for protection from Indian raids, which were quite frequently. We never knew when the Indians were going to attack and when they weren't going to attack. You can imagine each person standing in each one of these holes continuously shooting out, one round after another. The smell of the people, the smell of the guns, the smell of the fire. It got pretty rough in here. Even on our demonstrations, when we've had our Indian attacks, it still started stinking in here.
Yeah.
Upstairs is where all the single men would sleep. You're welcome to go up there and look around if you want to. The original station, we believe, was from mound to mound out here both ways. You notice there's a mound around the station. We believe that the original station was mound to mound both ways.
Wow.
Although this is a quarter-size replica, all the buildings here are original size.
Okay.
So, children to sleep upstairs, and you're talking anywhere from 10 to 14 children in a cabin like this. And even sometimes if a family was to come in and need a place to stay, they came in here with the other families.
Okay, they'd share them too, yes.
And the women mainly loaded the guns for the men, continuously firing. Although if a man got hurt, a woman would get up on top of the blockhouse or get on top of the rolls over here and shoot just as good as a man could.
Yes, I noticed that.
Now the big pots, cooking?
They're for cooking and dyeing.
Okay.
And my grandmother used to do cook soap.
Yeah, yeah. We've done that before with it.
The portion that we see right here with these beams in it are, this is one of the oldest portions of the house in the very front portion. This portion here that we're in right now, this room was not added until between 1830 and 1840. This is the remains of the old smokehouse. And it was reported that whenever Mrs. Bowen passed away, approximately 23 years after Mr. Bowen did, she still had 2 sides of beef, several hams, and several slabs of bacon hanging from those same exact rafters. Are you familiar with the old American chestnut tree?
I know about the chestnut.
You know how the blight had taken over and killed or destroyed most of them? Well, these timbers were cut out of chimney.
There's the loom.
Now with this portion here, actually was added on, as best we can tell, this was probably used as a formal dining area, even though now we have it interpreted as a weavery.
Can I take a few of those parts with me? To finish off mine?
Yeah, okay. So you're missing something.
No, I almost got everything.
They had, as a matter of fact, the young lady that does the spinning up here and usually works in the house had asked me, I need to make a cross piece and an upright for this distaff. And I told her, I said, yes, I can get a hold of the maple and I can turn it. I said, but if I put it on my spring pole lathe down at the fort, whenever I turn down that here, and on here, if she's spinning flax, the flax can be tied on right here, and you just draw from the flax. Exactly. So this is feeding your raw material. It comes past you as you adjust the thickness of the thread, and then it's wound, spun and wound onto the bottom.
Oh, okay.
So that's what this here is. What would happen is this door was here. The one that's directly above me upstairs was not. But what they could do is, as guests came by, this store would be closed and they would have basically their own portion of the house, their main dining and gathering area plus a sleeping facility upstairs. So they usually get on to folks about
Now, is this also an addition?
No,
this is
a portion of the original house here, where, like I say, we currently have it depicted as the girls' room, and that room over there is the boys', but they were not that way. Whenever the Bowens did not have guests here, I'm sure boys slept on one side and girls slept on the other, or quite sure maybe all of the children slept on one side and Mr. and Miss Bowen on the other side.
Yeah.
But as guests would come by to visit, this ended up being the side of the house. That is.
Yeah.
And then our rocking settee, or the nanny's bench, as we refer to it. It's got a little board on the front of it there where you can rock a child to sleep, or it can be removed and several adults sit on it and rock.
Yeah, we're gonna say goodbye. I think we'll head back to Nashville. We've had enough heat and humidity for a while. Now it's Sunday and we've decided to go to the Country Music Hall of Fame. And we got their diamond package so that we're going to go to the RCA recording studio and we're going to go to the Ryman Theater for a whopping $30 each. The way the museum is set up, we have here a special device that's talking to us.
He's not out much anymore. I don't know what the problem is.
But each floor has interactive screens. This is the case for the Singing Cowboys. You can see behind, they have all of this room for open posters. They put people's information. This is Jimmy Rogers. These are some of the nudie clothes. Someone who used to live in the Santa Clarita Valley, Cliff Stone. This guitar. Let's see.
Look at that.
This is a showcase. Got some wine. This is the whole thing on George Jones. Dolly Parton's stuff and a black suit of Johnny Cash. This is the violin. George Jones. Porter Wagner. He's the one who found Dolly Parton. These are some of the ones we know. There's George Straits, Trisha Yearwood, and here's her employment application. She worked at the Country Music Hall of Fame. Said her goal was to be an entertainer, so it looks like she got it. Alan Jackson, Vince Gill, Alice Krauss. There's Ken being silly. And Faith Hill.
Photograph with the mic at Sun Studio.
Yeah, and I could like run into those pictures. What I have to do again. What a surprise.
Here you'll be able to see Spence Manor, which was the premier hotel that all the celebrities would stay at. Elvis would always stay up here.
This is Spence Manor.
All right.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
Is it an apartment building now?
It's appropriate, right? Yeah, it's condos actually up there.
Now we're getting ready to look at the Ryman Theater. Well, we're at the Ryman Auditorium, which you can tell was church. This is Mini Pearl. Doing now is doing new development in downtown Nashville, and we have real high stories of condominiums like the one here. Real estate prices are going crazy. Belmont Mansion. We're not sure if it's open or not. We're going to see. what I'm going to do is just get a little closer on Traveler's Rest so that I can show where the original seam was. How they added on. Some of the other places. Now, so you're saying this area here was just for, basically for entertaining guests?
Yes.
I bet it would be too expensive for them to
heat it all.
Yeah. We just took a tour of Traveler's Rest, which looks like it was much more within the Confederacy, much longer than with Union forces. And it has a area underneath that spans the entire length of the house, which is unusual. And that's where people hid during the Battle of Nashville. Area that was known for breeding of Arabian horses also. This is merely a reproduction of what they think the barns might have been like, because they use this as a meeting place for social events. And then, like most southern places, this is the smokehouse, so that I'm sure that when they had their kitchen and everything else, they were trying to do it outside so that they wouldn't burn their houses down if something happened in the kitchen. Separate weaver's cottage also. But I'll tell you, all Ken talks about this entire trip was how good the bacon was, so he has to look at every smokehouse. This talks about Mary Overton. I guess her first husband's children lived into adulthood, all of her children. This is talking about the part where they were raising racehorses, Arabians. And these are some of the stables that were present in the 30s and 40s. Looking from the back, you can really see the changes for what was the original house and what they added. These two portions here that are brick were add-ons. It's unusual that this is the original portion of the house that is wood, because most of the homes we've seen in the South are all brick. Fact that he gave an individual 120 acres of land in 1799 to build this place. This is the Battle of Nashville that was held here, that everybody went underneath in the cellar, December 15th and 16th, 1964. Last trip was to the outlet mall, and now we're heading for the airport. And glad glad we got to see Opryland and stuff, but I'm sure and glad that we went to the Ryman Auditorium. Here is Opryland Hotel, and now it is the new home of the Grand Ole Opry, which is huge.
December the 7th, 1864 began as an unseasonably warm day. For nearly a week, Nashvillians had been bracing for a battle. On the outskirts of town, the 20,000-man Confederate Army of Tennessee was dug in, hoping to recapture the city, a place less than 3 years earlier they had given up without a fight. Now they were back, and awaiting them was a Union garrison of over 70,000 men under the command of the stark and stalwart George H. Thomas. Behind their fortifications, his troops lingered anxiously, as one Federal soldier remembered, for the ball to open. Then around noon, the weather began to change. A bitter northwest wind, followed by rain, sleet, and finally snow, rapidly dropped temperatures well below freezing. By the next morning, the ground was frozen solid.
December 9th. Cold weather. Commenced sleeting at 8 o'clock this morning and kept it up all day. Everything white with sleet and ice. Very cold. I have dug out a fireplace in the side of the ditch and burn cedar rails. Samuel T. Foster, 24th Texas Cavalry.
The battle, along with the fate of the war in the West, would have to wait. What many in the country believed in 1861 would be a short and almost bloodless campaign had, by the summer of 1864, evolved into a long and bitter struggle. The Civil War not only claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans, but destroyed cities and towns, homes and families. In its wake, it left mangled and vanquished bodies, all on a size and scale no one alive had ever seen before. For 3 years, massive armies had crisscrossed the American landscape, navigated the country's immense rivers, and waged great battles. From the railroad junctions of Virginia to the cornfields of Pennsylvania and Maryland to the banks of the Tennessee River, the war touched the lives of Americans everywhere. Still, amidst the carnage and destruction, the fighting raged on with no end in sight.
During the summer of 1864, It's clear that the Union war effort is now dictating the course of the war. Certainly the Union has the ascendancy. But the Confederacy is still a very potent force. It has two major field armies, Joe Johnston's force that is in Tennessee and Georgia, and then of course Robert E. Lee's famous Army of Northern Virginia that is in Virginia. These are sizable military concentrations, very expert soldiers. Defeating them is absolutely essential if the Union is going to win, and the Union is going to be very hard-pressed to do that.
By August of 1864, the once mighty Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee, was entrenched at Petersburg. All summer, his men had slugged it out between Washington and Richmond with the Union Army of the Potomac. Outmanned and undersupplied, Lee was determined to shatter the Northern resolve to wage war and possibly influence the re-election of Abraham Lincoln.
Summer of 1864, Lincoln is in big trouble, at least he thinks he is. On the 23rd of August, he writes a paper in which he takes the position that the Democratic Convention is assembling in Chicago, and at this time he feels that his administration will lose the election. If they lose the election, his administration between the 8th day of November, Election Day, and the 4th day of March will have to save the Union, because the president-elect will have won the presidency on such conditions he cannot save it after the day he's inaugurated.
Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant attacked Lee whenever and wherever possible, using his superior manpower and materials. When Lee stood and fought, Grant obliged him. In the West, the Confederates had been in retreat since the loss of Chattanooga in December of 1863. Joseph E. Johnston's Army of Tennessee now faced the prospect of conceding Atlanta to Union Commander William Tecumseh Sherman, and with it, the Deep South. It was a fate that did not sit well with Confederate President Jefferson Davis.
I had hoped and trusted from day to day that I should get news of a general battle, and I felt sure we should succeed. But day after day came and went, and there was no fight, while the army was still falling back, back, back. Jefferson Davis.
Dissatisfied with Johnston's defensive posturing in the face of Sherman's advance, Davis made a bold but controversial move. In mid-July, he stripped Johnston of command and replaced him with one of his junior officers, 33-year-old John Bell Hood. Hood was a Kentuckian. As a division commander, he had served in many of the war's major battles and carried the wounds to prove it. At Gettysburg, he was disabled when a shell fragment cost him the use of his left arm. Then at Chickamauga, a mini ball struck him in the right leg just below the hip, shattering the bone.
The withered left arm would not be disabling. The amputation of the right leg with nothing below the hip means that while he can wear a prosthesis, he has difficulty getting around. He has to be strapped on a horse, and whether he is on laudanum, it's debatable. Whether he's on whiskey, it's debatable. But he is definitely in a lot of pain.
Hood believed Johnston had squandered several chances to destroy Sherman in North Georgia. Now, given the opportunity, he would not do the same. He immediately went on the offensive, attacking the Union Army around Atlanta. In just 2 weeks, Sherman inflicted over 20,000 rebel casualties. On September 1st, Hood was forced to abandon the city altogether.
When Atlanta is taken out, this takes essentially the South Atlantic away from the region between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And so the Confederacy, from the taking of Atlanta, is divided into thirds. And no more can the so-called Western Theater provide any kind of direct material support to Lee's army.
With the fate of his army, and possibly the war, now hanging in the balance, Hood devised a new plan to strike at Sherman's supply lines, hoping to lure the general out of Atlanta. By the 1st of October, it seemed as if Hood's strategy was working. But as his army continued to move further west, Sherman retreated. In mid-November, he set out for the Atlantic coast and making, in his words, Georgia howl.
It was clear to me that he had no intention to meet us in open battle, and the lightness and celerity of his army convinced me that I could not possibly catch him on a stern chase. I went to prepare for my big raid. On the 1st of November, I went nothing in Atlanta but what is necessary for war. I proposed to abandon Atlanta and the railroad back to Chattanooga, to sally forth to ruin Georgia and bring up on the seashore William Tecumseh Sherman.
In late October, Hood swept across northern Alabama to Tuscumbia. After a 3-week delay, the 36,000-man Army of Tennessee set out for Nashville, the heart of Union occupation in the West since early 1862. The city was the South's main transportation hub, a distinction Nashvillians had spent decades building.
Saturday morning, December 28, 1850. The Iron Horse in harness, the new locomotive Tennessee, was put in gear yesterday evening and made a trial trip of a mile out of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. The little excursion was witnessed with much interest by a number of our speculators, some of whom took passage. It marks an era in our history. A.M. Rossborough.
When the railroad arrived in 1850, Nashville was already established as a haven for economic enterprise. A river town for much of its history, it could be said that on the eve of the war, only New Orleans rivaled the city in size and importance south of the Ohio River.
Nashville was a small town before the Civil War. It was a city that was a distribution center. There were no major industries. It was not a great industrial town, but it was a town that received goods and merchandise and resold it and shipped it out to the smaller towns in a 100 and 150 mile radius of Nashville.
Daily, steamboats packed the Cumberland River wharfs. Between 1850 and 1860, 341 different freight companies docked in town where rice, coffee, sugar, and household wares arrived to stock the city's dry goods stores along the square. In the decade before the war, the railroad transformed commercial trade once again. Hundreds of miles of track connected Nashville with a host of new destinations, including Chicago and Charleston. The wealth generated spawned unparalleled improvements.
Prior to the Civil War, Nashville was the center of learning and culture. It was the seat of the University of Nashville, headed by Dr. Philip Lindsley and then his son, John Berrien Lindsley. It also had a medical school affiliated with it. There was also Dr. Shelby's Medical College, which was a private medical school here in Nashville. There were theaters in Nashville. The Adelphi Theater was one of the largest theaters west of the Appalachians. Jenny Lind performed there with P.T. Barnum in the early 1850s. So Nashville had a lot of activity. It had a lot of learned people in it.
The city built a municipal water system, a gas-light company, a fire department, and in 1855 became the first southern city to establish a public school system. Few could argue that by 1860 Nashville was living up to its new distinction as the Athens of the South. No Southern institution was affected more by the war than slavery.
The free black and the slave population in Nashville, just before the war, 1860 census, was around about 4,000 people, and about 700, a little over 700 were free Negroes. So 1 out of every 5 blacks in town is a free person, legally free. Slaves in the city carried out different kinds of tasks and chores. There were different kinds of constraints, and yet there was much more freedom enjoyed by them than they would enjoy under masters in the rural area.
By 1860, slavery was well entrenched in Nashville. The town's muddy streets and planked sidewalks were often filled with both white and black faces. It was in the city where slaves toiled as caterers and barbers, hack drivers and shoemakers. They labored at the docks, along the wharves, and in the city's warehouses.
When the Union Army occupied Nashville, they found an institution that was very different from the plantation slavery that they had read about. In cities, slaves often enough were pretty close to being their own boss. They hired out their own time. They made almost contracts for themselves in terms of the work that they would do for various jobbers. They were still owned persons. The money they made went to their masters. They were still supervised as a race. But in terms of having a freedom of action as individual workers, urban slavery was very different.
They also worked and lived in the homes of the wealthy as servants and nursemaids. As one former slave remembered, "My master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will. There is might in each." Slaves represented an immense sum of money to their owners. At any given time, they could be used as security for loans, sold to satisfy debts, and traded as a form of investment. From an early age, slave children were taught that their primary value was in the market. When Tennessee left the Union in June of 1861, Nashville's water and rail corridors made the city a prime objective of the Federal Army. Then in early February of 1862, Union troops captured Fort Donelson. A retreating Confederate army left the city undefended. Nashvillians panicked.
The citizens of Nashville were terrified by the prospect of the Union Army coming in because in the last months leading up to secession, the radical Southern point of view had included all kinds of tales about what would happen, that the city would be destroyed, that the buildings would be burned out, and people would just be dealt with in horrendous ways, and there was really fear in the city.
There was no real control in the city by anyone over what was happening. The Confederates were slowly evacuating. Terry's Texas Rangers, for example, were sleeping on the ground floor of what's now the Downtown Presbyterian Church. Mrs. Pearl across the street, whose husband was the first school superintendent of Nashville, talked about fires breaking out around the city, about the troops trying to hold some control, Forrest coming in and out of the city trying to contain what was going on. Rumors had been floated that the federal government was going to shell the city first from the federal ironclads floating down the flooded Cumberland River. If this wasn't bad enough, part of the city was literally under flood water. And what they didn't destroy by shelling, then they would burn the city to whatever remained, and Nashville would become an object lesson to every other Confederate state capital, because it was going to be the first state capital of the Confederacy to know federal conquest and occupation.
The Federal Army took little time establishing a base of operations.
The Union Army really came to Nashville with a plan. They set about to acquire warehouses and buildings for storage of supplies and equipment.
They seized everything on 2nd Avenue from Church Street to Broad and most of the east side of Broadway for warehouses and hospitals. There was a system of over 21 hospitals in Nashville where they seized not only these commercial buildings but also sometimes private residences, like Adelicia Ackland had wounded recuperating troops at Belmont Mansion, and they seized churches. The Downtown Presbyterian Church, McKendree, a number of the churches in town were seized and converted into hospital spaces during the war.
Troops from the Federal Army, black refugees from surrounding plantations, and northern laborers flooded the city.
The Union Army brought in specialists, trained and skilled mechanics to operate rail equipment. They built a big maintenance shop in Nashville, an enormous structure they could take trains or locomotives and cars of all sorts in and repair and maintain them. They had a shop that even built hospital cars for the railroads.
Union soldiers by the tens of thousands would pass through Nashville. While in town, they visited the mansions of the planter elite, prayed alongside locals in the churches, and patronized the bars and brothels near the wharf. They also constructed a series of defenses that made Nashville the most heavily fortified city in North America outside of Washington. The largest, Fort Negley, covered 4 acres and used over 2,700 black laborers, many impressed refugees from local plantations.
As time went on, the soldiers became a part of the Nashville scene. And before the end of the war, they were Nashville and the Union had become really reluctant partners in pursuing the end of the war.
It was clear by 1864 that Nashville was to be protected at any cost. Anticipating Hood's drive north, Grant dispatched one of Sherman's most accomplished generals in early October to defend the city against a possible Confederate invasion. Though a Virginian, George H. Thomas had remained loyal to the Union, a decision he paid for personally when his sisters informed him it were best if he changed his name.
Thomas is easily one of the best Union commanders in the war, arguably perhaps the best in terms of a combat soldier. He had certainly proven in the Battle of Chickamauga that he could handle any emergency that could possibly come at him, because the Union Army was terribly defeated at Chickamauga, except for Thomas's contingent, who held out for hours up on the top of Snodgrass Hill.
At age 48, Thomas was much beloved by his men, who fondly referred to him as Old Pap. To others, he seemed dreadfully slow. Sherman wrote to Grant that in Thomas's army, a fresh furrow in a plowed field will stop the entire column and all begin to entrench.
So Thomas has a reputation of being an extremely competent general. He would be the logical choice to handle a situation like Nashville, where he would have to worry about what Hood might be able to do.
Upon his arrival in Nashville, Thomas pushed to complete the still unfinished Union fortifications using black refugees, local citizens, and even convalescents from the numerous Union hospitals in town. Thomas was also given the task of building an army.
Thomas never really has an army when he's sent to Nashville to defend the place. What he has are a series of units, primarily that are ones that William Tecumseh Sherman did not want. Much of what Thomas is given are soldiers who aren't part of the first team.
Still, by the middle of November, his command was incomplete. Thomas needed to buy some time. In mid-November, after 3 weeks stuck south of the Tennessee River, Hood finally moved north.
On the 21st, they start north from Columbia, moving in 3 columns, aiming for Columbia.
After a brief engagement at Columbia with the Union 23rd Corps under the command of John Schofield, Hood's roommate at West Point, the two made a dash for Spring Hill. The Confederates attempted to cut Schofield off before he crossed the Harpeth River. Miscommunication between rebel commanders, however, allowed the Union to escape to Franklin. Incensed, Hood ordered his army to bring Schofield to battle. Finally, at a little after 4 in the afternoon on November 30th, with the Union soldiers dug in around the small town of Franklin, the Army of Tennessee attacked. By 9 in the evening, most of the fighting had subsided. The Confederates took over 6,000 casualties, more than 2,000 dead. The losses were staggering.
5 Confederate generals dead, 1 mortally wounded. As many Confederates killed there, 4 hours out of over 19,000 men, then they lost out of 44,000 dead at Shiloh.
When morning broke, Schofield was gone.
There's great destruction of human life here. I have seen places where blood ran off in a stream, and also to stand in pools in places. General Hood has betrayed us. This is not the kind of fighting he promised us. A fight with equal numbers and the choice of the ground. It can't be called anything else but cold-blooded murder. Samuel Foster, 24th Texas Cavalry.
Thomas was relieved by the news of Schofield's victory, but fully anticipated Hood, despite his losses, would advance to Nashville. The next day, the Army of Tennessee began arriving just south of town. Hood himself took up residence at Traveler's Rest, the plantation home of Colonel John Overton.
With news of the Army of Tennessee returning home and besieging their own state capital, the city was of mixed emotion. Thousands of Nashvillians had already taken an oath of loyalty to the United States, and they had been convinced that the United States was going to become whole again. But others were still hopeful that the Army of Tennessee could be victorious.
From his headquarters, Hood directed the army to begin building fortifications, hoping Thomas would leave his entrenched defenses and attack. To his right, Hood deployed Frank Cheatham. He held Cheatham, a Nashvillian, personally responsible for the escape of the Union Army at Spring Hill, then seemed to make his men pay for the debacle the next day at Franklin, where they were ordered to lead the assault against the Union entrenchments. The campaign into Tennessee was his first assignment as a corps commander. In the center was Stephen D. Lee, the youngest lieutenant general in the Confederate Army. He had not seen major combat in over a year after being captured when Vicksburg fell in July of 1863. At age 31, Lee now commanded Hood's old corps. On the left stood A.P. Stewart, a native Tennessean. Stewart had been a corps commander since mid-June when Leonidas Polk, the fighting bishop, was killed at Pine Mountain. Now he was expected to withstand the brunt of the Union attack behind a series of redoubts along the Hillsborough Pike. Hood's army was stretched terribly thin. When 2 cavalry divisions under Nathan Bedford Forrest were detached and sent to Murfreesboro, they were left little room for error.
Hood's one chance is to remain as mobile as possible, to be something of a fox, pushing the hounds to give chase to him. As long as Hood is mobile, he is a dangerous factor. But after having decimated his own army at Franklin, he then proceeds to set up a siege. He entrenches on the hills just south of town. And in doing that, doesn't even cover all of the road net leading out of Nashville. So he does the very thing that he really should not do, which is to set himself up in the passive defense, which is really all but inviting Thomas to attack him.
By December 5th, Thomas could wield an effective force of over 55,000 men, more than twice the size of Hood's army. As final preparations were being made, word came from an anxious Washington for Thomas to attack. Grant, it seemed, was growing impatient. He feared Hood might skirt Nashville and make a run for the Ohio River. If Thomas did not act, Grant threatened to remove him.
In my opinion, Ulysses S. Grant had never liked Thomas. Undoubtedly began back in May 1862, when General Halleck comes to the front, having to quiet all this uproar in the press directed against Grant and Sherman for being surprised at Shiloh.
For almost a week, the two traded telegrams. Then, on the 7th, the weather turned from bad to worse, dumping ice and then snow. On the morning of the 11th, remembered by all as Cold Sunday, the temperature dropped to single digits.
Thomas gets a pass for several days, but the letters start coming again.
Though unconvinced of the difficulties created by the winter storm, Grant relented, only to order General John Logan to Louisville to take command. Then, on the morning of the 14th, the weather changed again. This time, temperatures rose and the ice began to melt. After meeting with his commanders at his headquarters, the St. Cloud Hotel, Thomas ordered the attack at first light. Seemed the ball was finally about to open.
The die is cast, ready or not. Many of the men set themselves down to write to their homes in the north, some to their families, some to their sweethearts. No one knows who shall be taken or who shall be left. Benjamin T. Smith, 51st Illinois.
Early on the morning of the 15th, the Union camps began to stir. The icy landscape that had made battle virtually impossible for nearly a week was gone. In its place, a thick fog draped the capital.
On the 15th, Thomas has set in motion a plan that certainly has every possibility of working. But almost from the moment that it starts, things start to go wrong. In the first instance, you have the fact of the weather. There is a deep, deep fog that just shrouds the battlefield in cloud cover for quite some time. And Civil War armies just simply cannot operate if they cannot see.
Thomas, however, was undeterred.
He'll move out like a scythe with his right wing. Harry Wilson taking the lead going out the Charlotte Road, followed by Whiskey Smith's infantry. He then, at the same time, Stedman over on the extreme Union left near the Murfreesboro Pike and the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad.
If all went according to plan, Thomas would send over 30,000 men crashing against the Confederate redoubts and collapse Hood's entire line. With the fog finally lifting around 8 o'clock, Stedman advanced down the Murfreesboro Pike 2 miles from town before turning southwest. In his front, dug in above a ravine overlooking the Nashville to Chattanooga Railroad, were 300 men from Granbury's brigade, Texans. After losing their commander at Franklin, they were spoiling for a fight.
It was very foggy that morning, and out of the fog, the Confederate troops under Cheatham see a large body of troops moving toward their rear. And they can see the body moving toward them for some time before they realize it's U.S. colored troops. And this army had not battled U.S. colored troops before.
Pushing back rebel skirmishers, Stedman's colored regiments made their way up the long incline and came within sight of a lunette supported by rebel artillery. The Confederates unloaded with musket and canister. In a panic, the colored troops hurled themselves into the railroad ravine.
Confederate troops that were located not very far away from them in Granbury's Lunette could look right down on those African American troops and just fire right into them and shoot them as though they were fish in a barrel.
Cut off and surrounded, the regiments were nearly annihilated.
It's said that the wagon streamed into the colored hospital, which was Colored Hospital, the hospital number 16. And all night that night, as they worked on these men who were wounded, you know, men who were dead, and so on.
It seemed the day was not starting off as Thomas had planned. On the federal right, things were not much better. The dense fog had slowed the deployment of both Wilson's cavalry and Smith's infantry, delaying their advance by several hours. Finally, at 10 in the morning, Wilson ordered his men forward. Swiftly they swung across the Harding Pike, catching Confederate cavalry under the command of General James Chalmers by surprise.
A Confederate soldier from Ector's brigade from Texas looked out and he saw this enormous movement coming toward him. And Ector's brigade just had 600 or 700 men, and they're watching tens of thousands of U.S. troops moving out Charlotte and Harding Pike to hit Hood's detached redoubts, number 4 and 5. About 2 o'clock, both infantry and dismounted U.S. cavalry spring forward to attack Redoubt 4. The numbers involved appear to be 7,000 or 8,000 men headed toward 150 men in Redoubt 4. They give a few volleys and almost immediately are engulfed. There were several brothers there from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the Rossers. Their little brother, Highland Rosser, had had his brains blown out by an artillery shell. The two brothers stayed there to bury his body. They didn't think they could go back home, having left him on the field in that condition, and are captured.
When these units are attacked, or when these redoubts are attacked, they very quickly fall, simply because there are no Confederate infantry supports behind them to defend the redoubts once they're under assault.
Most of the Confederate soldiers were able to see in the distance as Redoubt 4 fell. The U.S. troops immediately moved on and took Redoubt 5. Shortly after that, 3 was taken. A.P. Stewart realized he was in a vice. With 6,000 men, he had the U.S. Army attacking him on the front and flank. He still had a line of retreat. He ordered both of his division commanders, Walthall and Loring, to pull out.
Hood's army fled south down the Granny White Pike.
With the collapse of the Confederate left, General Hood takes advantage of darkness, which comes early, and falls back about 2 miles to another position.
An elated George Thomas made his way to the telegraph office, eager to relay his success to Washington. The wounded were carried from the battlefield to homes used as makeshift hospitals. There, surgeons struggled to save the dying.
Visiting one of our tents, I find the surgeon with his assistants up to their elbows in gore. A Confederate is stretched out on the table. His right leg is being sawed off just below the knee. He is revived and is carted away to make room for a boy in blue, with a bullet through his arm and one in his breast. And so the ghastly work goes on all night long.
As the skies darkened and the campfires were lit, the Union Army watched and waited.
I shall ever remember the feeling of desolation that came upon me as 6 of us gathered late that night under a big oak tree across the road from Colonel Overton's home, and realized that we were all that remained of 1,000 men. James McNeely, 49th Tennessee.
When the sun came up on the 16th, a deep fog again covered the battlefield. The low visibility, however, did not obscure the fact that Hood remained.
Hood might very well have headed for Franklin the night of the 15th. Most of the U.S. generals thought that Hood would head to Franklin on the night of the 15th. But Schofield had been with Hood at West Point, and Schofield said, "You don't know Hood like I do. He'll be there waiting for you in the morning." And of course he was.
During the night, Confederate engineers had patched together a 2-mile-long defensive position anchored on the right by Lee's corps and on the left by Cheatham. In the center, behind a stone wall that bounded the Lee plantation, was Stuart. All morning, Union artillery pounded the Confederate defenses as Thomas's army took up positions to envelop both rebel flanks. After confusion among the Union command over where the main attack should fall, Federal troops were determined to renew their assault against the Confederate left.
Thomas has a battle plan in which he's going to go against the Confederate left again, just like he did the previous day. But General Schofield fears an attack by Hood. He delays. Thomas has to come over and find out what's going on. The Union troops aren't attacking. And so for hours, nothing is going on the entire line of attack while the Union commanders debate.
Then, around noon, a cold rain began to fall.
Over on the Union left, General Wood, who's one of the corps commanders, and particularly one of his brigade commanders, Sidney Post, make a decision on their own to assault the Confederate right. This starts one of the bloodiest parts of the entire battle.
On the Union left, Wood's corps, along with 2 brigades of United States colored troops, had made several unsuccessful assaults against a small hill in what had been in years past the Overton Peach Orchard. In the early afternoon, they tried again.
Several of the U.S. colored troops actually made it into an abatis on the hill and planted their flag. This flag was later captured, and it was the one that's so well known because it was presented by the colored ladies of Murfreesboro.
The rebel fire tore through the Union ranks. Among the 220 killed, 5 Union color bearers. As one Confederate soldier remembered, the men fell like wheat before a mowing machine.
It is probably the best example of black soldiers in combat, other than the crater, out in Virginia, in the whole Civil War.
Lee's men are going to stand tall. They're going to turn back. P. Sidney Post's brigade, he's going to be wounded. Other Union forces attacking from north to south are repulsed. Hood probably feels good. I may get away from here tonight.
To the west, 4 Union infantry and 2 cavalry divisions waited impatiently all morning for orders to advance. The steep rise in their front, a hill in the middle of Felix Compton's cornfield, carried an entrenched Confederate position.
At the time, it was called Compton's Hill, after the family that owned it. It became known as Shies Hill because the colonel of the 20th Tennessee Regiment on top of Shies Hill was killed with a bullet hole to the brain. The Confederate soldiers that were on Shies Hill had been up much of the night trying to figure out a way to fortify it. So they've been involved in a battle on the first day. They've got very little rations. They're tired. The weather's wet and damp. They're miserable. Their nervous system cannot be aided by artillery fire throughout the day.
Hours are going past, nothing is happening. Because it's a winter day, the various Union commanders know that something has to be done quickly. Wilson, on his own initiative, heads around behind the Confederate left, looking for the roads to cut, particularly the Hillsborough Pike. He gains success. Almost at exactly the same time, Division Commander John MacArthur, in charge of one of Smith's divisions, makes the decision on his own to go straight up the hill after the Confederates that are in Bates' division.
As darkness began to shadow the battlefield, MacArthur attacked. His men, mostly Minnesotans, charged up the hill.
Now the Yankees are going to be in some danger as they begin their advance, if you can see them well. But the closer they get and the steeper the slope is, they become more difficult to see.
The problem the Tennesseans had with defending Shies Hill was that the line was built on the crest of the hill rather than the military crest, and it was impossible to fire down at the attacking troops.
Some of the fighting was hand-to-hand.
As Wilson's cavalry, fighting dismounted with repeating weapons, are forcing Chalmers's men back from the Hillsborough Pike, that rugged area north of the Brentwood Hill, as they come closer and closer to Granny White.
Within minutes, the rebels broke. Quickly, panic spread through the entire line. What remained of Cheatham's corps fled toward the Franklin Pike. To their right, Stuart's men, defending against a frontal attack from behind the stone wall, broke as well. Those that could not run were captured. Witnessing the debacle from Peach Orchard Hill, Lee tried to rally the troops, but to no avail. He, too, ordered his men to retreat. The fighting continued well into the night, including at one point a saber duel between Union and Confederate cavalry. But the battle for Nashville was over.
General Thomas is obviously happy. In the course of 2 successive days, he has driven the Army of Tennessee from 2 entrenched positions, 2 strong entrenched positions. He's captured thousands of prisoners. He's captured artillery. He has completely demoralized his enemy. He has achieved one of the great battlefield victories of the war. But yet, having done all that, Thomas is still not completely at ease with himself, because he wants what every Army commander wants, and that is to completely destroy his enemy, and Hood's Army of Tennessee still exists.
For 10 days, Union cavalry pushed the retreating rebels further south. Finally, the day after Christmas, what remained of the Southern Army crossed the Tennessee River. Hood's campaign to recapture Nashville was a disaster. He had lost over 2/3 of his army, some 23,000 men. When General Beauregard caught up with the men in Tupelo in mid-January, he later wrote, "If not, in the strictest sense of the word, a disorganized mob, it was no longer an army." Hood resigned. With Sherman's march to the sea ending in the capture of Savannah just before Christmas, any hope of a Confederate victory in the West was over. Broken beyond repair, the Army of Tennessee finally surrendered in April of 1865. Until his death, John Bell Hood defended his campaign into Tennessee, laying blame at the feet of his subordinate officers and, on occasion, the men of the Army. In 1879, while living in New Orleans, he, his wife, and several of his children contracted yellow fever and died. George Thomas lived until 1870, when he suffered a fatal heart attack in San Francisco. His last days were spent trying to expose Schofield's hand behind Grant's intent to relieve him in the final hours before the battle. He never, even in death, received credit for his war record or the overwhelming victory at Nashville. Tennesseans, much like the rest of the South, would struggle to fully recognize the rights of their former slaves. On the battlefield, black soldiers had won conditional respect, but they would continue fighting to hang on to their freedom. Their battle for Nashville was over. A new battle, however, was just beginning. The Union Army remained until 1867. Few Nashvillians could argue that their presence had not left the city with an indelible legacy. Escaping much of the war's material destruction, Nashville became, by the turn of the century, a beacon of the New South. But for those who lived to see the war's end, many of their tragedies and hardships became nothing more than a distant memory. Only the scars of battle dotted the Nashville landscape. Eventually they too, touched by the patina of time, slowly faded away.
Adelicia Ackland was one of the most interesting people of 19th century Tennessee. Her home, Belmont, is one of the finest examples of Italian villa-style architecture in America, and it can still be seen today on the grounds of Belmont University in Nashville near Music Row. Its creator lived a life full of triumph and tragedy. As a teenager, Adelicia was engaged to be married, but lost her first love to typhoid fever. Later in life, she lost 2 of her 3 husbands, 6 of her 10 children, while she herself lived to a ripe old age. This was a woman who knew how to survive. She had incredible wealth, lost it, then gained it again. She survived the Civil War and overcame a number of life's ups and downs. This was Adelicia. Look closely at her life and you'll discover a lady who was a trailblazer in her own time, when it was rare for a woman to be her own master. Adelicia and her second husband, Joseph Ackland, built Belmont. It was a marvel to see, a place like no other. It included Nashville's first zoo, with birds, monkeys, bears, even alligators. There was a 200-foot-long greenhouse with unique night-blooming cirrus, camellias, cacti, and a Victoria Regina water lily. The estate included a bowling alley, an art gallery, a modern water tower with a steam engine at its base to pump water throughout the 180-acre property, plus a gas refinery to provide lighting for the house. This was the mid-1800s. Days gone by, but in Nashville it was certainly the time of Adelicia.
I'm John Norris. This is a unique piece of Tennessee history, so join me for a step back in time and a look at the place called Belmont and its builder, Adelicia Ackland.
I think Adelicia Acklin is the most fascinating Tennessean in the 19th century. And I think that Belmont Mansion is the finest house in 19th century Tennessee. Adelicia was a woman many decades ahead of her time. She was very much aware of where she wanted to go, and she knew how to get there. With her 3 husbands and the estates that she inherited from 2 of them, she, with husband number 2 and husband number 3, was solely in control of that portion of her estate. It wasn't community property shared with the 2 husbands. And this house is one result of that planning and that determination. The detailing in the house is wonderful. The layout of the house is very grand, and the landscape even made it more so. Adelicia went all out. She spared no expense in the furnishings or in the landscaping of the estate, and it was the finest estate in pre-Civil War Tennessee, and I think it retained that status even after the Civil War.
Adelicia Hayes was born on March 15, 1817. She was the 3rd child of Oliver Bliss Hayes and Sarah Hightower. He moved to Tennessee in 1808, practiced law, bought and sold land, then met and married Sarah Hightower of Williamson County, the daughter of a wealthy planter. Adelicia's father had his daughter educated at the Nashville Female Academy, the leading school for young ladies in Nashville. In her senior year, her father purchased a large tract of land south of the city and moved the family to Rokeby. It's here that she meets her first love.
Adelicia was engaged to Alfonso Gibbs, and they had already set for their engagement portraits before he died. And Adelicia's portrait is at the State Museum today. What is so interesting about it, and what has puzzled us for years, was she's in black, and no one could figure out why you would be in black for an engagement portrait. When it was conserved several years ago, the conservator said, oh no, she was in a white dress. It was painted black at a later date, so the family painted her dress black to show the appropriate mourning costume.
Well, he died, and she did not have any suitors that she was interested in for 5 years. She was still in mourning and grieving. But 5 years later, she was visiting up in Gallatin, and there are a number of accounts of how she met Isaac Franklin. I think the account I like the best is they were having a picnic up there, and she sang sort of a sentimental love ballad, and he saw her, he heard her singing, and that ballad won him over. They were married. They had 4 children by the first marriage, and tragically, one of the children, the only male child, died very shortly after his birth. 2 of the other girls died as children, and after her second marriage, the 4th and final of the Franklin children died at about the age of 11 of diphtheria. So, very tragic life. She's lost her husband at this point as well by 1846. He's about 30 years older than she is, and he dies.
In a letter, Adelicia's father wrote, "I'm not sure how many more vicissitudes of this life my daughter can bear."
Adelicia was not yet 30 years old, and she became a very, very wealthy, attractive young widow. She inherited 6 plantations in Louisiana, over 30,000 undeveloped acres in Texas, stocks and bonds in a railroad company, a turnpike company, several banks, 750 slaves, the Nashville racetrack, a farm on the north side of Nashville called Fairview. Altogether, it amounted to about $1 million worth of assets, which of course in the 1840s was a tremendous fortune, especially for a lady to manage.
She then meets Joseph Alexander Smith Acklin, whose grandfather was a founder of Huntsville, Alabama. He is introduced to her by Mrs. John C. Bell, who was a yeatman. Her family was a prominent banking family here in Nashville and down in Murray County, and it's a real love match.
A couple of days before the wedding, Adelicia did ask Joseph to sign a marriage contract. Today we would call that a prenuptial agreement. It was one of the first on record in the South. But once she had that assurance, she then did turn over most of the business to Joseph, which turned out to be a very good decision. According to the 1860 census, they were worth about $3 million, which means Joseph had tripled Adelicia's wealth in about a decade.
The story of Belmont is one of the most fascinating stories in American history. Construction began just after the Acklins married in 1849.
And they start construction of Belmont soon after their marriage and move in the late summer of 1853. The amazing thing is they built the house just to be a summer home. They never really intended to live in the house year-round. They continued to winter on her plantations in Louisiana. She also had another house in downtown Nashville as well.
Belmont Mansion is significant because it is a unique example of 19th century residential architecture in America. It represents the coming together of a patron, a woman of exquisite taste, education, and refinement, an architect who was trained in the royal courts at Potsdam, Germany, and limitations only by the materials that were available in mid-19th century Nashville.
The architecture is based on the work of a 16th century architect by the name of Andre Palladio. And the house is built in the Palladian style with its two-story central section and then the flanking one-story wings on either side of it that recess back from the main plane of the house. The use of the statuary across the front of the house is also typical of this Palladian style, as well as the strong symmetry in the center of the house, with the front door and the cupola accenting the exact center of the house.
Some of the things that set this house apart are things like all of the really large cast iron pieces, all of the cast iron on the balconies, all of the cast iron statuary out in the yard, and the gazebos. All of these things are very unique to this area and this part of the country. And this beautiful setting was the backdrop for Adelicia's many lavish parties and elegant dinners. She entertained many notable locals such as Randall McGavick and William Walker, but also nationally known personalities such as Alexander Graham Bell.
For a while, Adelicia and Joseph enjoyed great fortune. Then came the Civil War. The war started in 1861. However, it wasn't until 1862 that it came to Nashville. When the word arrived that Fort Donelson had fallen, the occupation of Nashville was inevitable. Joseph fled south to protect the Acklins' Louisiana holdings, never to return. He died toward the end of the war of unknown causes, leaving Adelicia a widow for the second time. Following the death of her second husband, Joseph, Adelicia Acklin is left alone to make a decision on how to protect her interests.
Adelicia learned that the cotton that was in storage in Louisiana was about to be burned or fall into enemy hands, so she took a female cousin, hired a gunboat, and the two of them went down the Mississippi River to her plantations. The commanding Confederate officer was a Polk boy from Columbia, so she knew him, so she went a-calling and told him, "Leonidas, I'm $100,000 in debt. I've not been able to sell a cotton crop since 1860. If you don't let me sell this cotton, I'm going to have to declare bankruptcy, and I'm in debt to all of your friends back in Nashville, and I'm going to tell them who made me do it." So he issued an order for her to consolidate all of her cotton onto the one plantation in Angola. She went to the Union Army and told them a slightly different story. She told them that she was going to sell the cotton to a Union cotton broker in New Orleans if she could manage to get it out of Confederate hand, and besides, those nasty Confederates had confiscated all of her cotton and all of her wagons. She didn't have any way of moving this cotton. She's just a poor widow woman. What is she going to do? So the Union Army allowed her to hire Union wagons and Union mules to haul the cotton. Seeing the cotton being moved, the Confederates placed a guard on the cotton to protect it from the Union Army. They get suspicious that something isn't quite right, and they confiscate everything. Retreating into Mississippi with her cotton, she chases after them, and the Union Army chases after all of them. She then catches up with the Confederates, and there's a new commanding general who arrests her for illegal movement of the cotton. For 3 days, she negotiates for the release of her cotton. the Union mules, the wagons, and herself. Successful, she moves her cotton back to Angola and starts shipping it to New Orleans, where her agent sells the first load of it, but he does not receive a good price for it. Adelicia is furious. She goes to New Orleans and negotiates with the federal authorities to allow the cotton to be shipped to England, where it's sold to the Rothschilds, and according to her cousin, she clears $960,000 on the deal, which she specified be left in gold in England until the war is over.
Adelicia returns from Louisiana just in time to see her home occupied by Union troops as they prepared for the Battle of Nashville. The landscape was totally decimated. All the trees and fencing were torn down, but fortunately the house was unharmed.
After the Civil War, Adelicia Ackland was really not very popular in Nashville. She had come out of the Civil War with a lot of money because she'd been able to get her cotton through the blockade and over to England, where it had fetched a handsome price. So she decided she would take her children and go on the grand tour to Europe. While in Europe, she purchased many of the art objects that you see in the house today, particularly some of the statuary. The statue of Ruth gleaning, she purchased in Italy. The statue of Rebecca at the well was also purchased in Europe. She also was very popular with Napoleon III and his wife in Paris, and attended many of the balls there. And in fact, Empress Eugenie gave her a beautiful pin that she wore from time to time. So she had quite an extended trip in Europe.
Adelicia was to marry a third time to Dr. William Archer Cheatham. He was an interesting man who was director of the Tennessee Insane Asylum. Under his direction, a place was created that was considered to be the most advanced institution for the humane treatment of the mentally ill.
In 1867, Adelicia marries again for the third time at the age of 50 to a Nashville physician named Dr. William Cheatham. They had a small private ceremony here at Belmont Mansion, but then a couple of weeks later they had a very large wedding reception. About 2,000 guests attended. The house was awash with beautiful light and soft music, and one reporter got so excited about who was here and what they were serving and what everyone was wearing that he forgot to mention the groom's name anywhere in his article. Adelicia, of course, was wearing her diamond tiara that Napoleon III had sent her as a wedding present. She was also wearing her diamond necklace, diamond bracelet, diamond ring, and diamond belt. In fact, one reporter said that you could not tell if the bride had retained her youthful beauty, for you could not see her for the glitter of her diamonds.
Here was a lady who came out of the war with a fortune still intact, married to a prominent Nashville physician, raising 2 stepchildren who adored her, along with the 4 Ackland children. Yet more trouble was around the corner. She found herself caught in the panic of 1873, the second worst depression in American history. From her Louisiana property, Adelicia gave her own reflection on the situation in a note to a friend.
We take our meals in the sitting room, and I have converted the old dining room into a kitchen. It is so convenient. I am there often supervising my cook, who is not very proficient, but we live plainly, no desserts to prepare.
By 1876, after recouping her fortune, Adelicia begins traveling again. Her oldest son, Joseph, was elected to the United States Congress, and third cousin, Rutherford B. Hayes, was elected president during this time, so of course she became familiar with Washington society.
In 1884, Adelicia went to Florida for the winter, and the following spring did not return to Belmont, but went to Washington, D.C. instead. Dr. Cheatham did not go with her. We have no idea as to why he did not go with her, and we have no idea why she herself decided to move to Washington, D.C. But Dr. Cheatham moved into downtown Nashville and then eventually would move in with his daughter. Adelicia rented a house in Washington, D.C., and according to the D.C. papers, kept a major social scene going and bought a lot at 1776 Massachusetts Avenue. And at the age of 69, started construction of yet another house in what was then known as Millionaire's Row. Once the spring social season was over, she and Pauline went on to New York City on a shopping trip. While there, she contracted pneumonia and died at the age of 70. Her body was brought back here to Nashville, and she was buried in the family mausoleum in Mount Olivet Cemetery.
She's buried there with her first husband, her second husband, and some of the children from both of the marriages. But Adelicia also has the Peary, one of her favorite statues, there in the mausoleum. And two of the urns from the front of Belmont Mansion are lining the walkway leading to the mausoleum.
In 1887, Adelicia sold her magnificent Belmont estate to a land development company. It was purchased by two ladies from Philadelphia, Miss Heron and Miss Hood, who opened a school for young ladies in 1890. They added the first academic building onto the back of the house at this time, which can still be seen today on Wedgwood Avenue in Nashville. Belmont College for Young Women merged with Ward Seminary in 1913 and became known as Ward Belmont, an academy and junior college. The current institution, Belmont University, became a co-educational four-year college in 1951. Today, visitors come from all over the world to view this spectacular Italian-style villa, perched on one of the beautiful hills of Nashville. A guided walk through the rooms of Belmont is a journey into the history of the Old South. This magnificent home is furnished in Victorian opulence, with original and period pieces, gilded mirrors, marble statues, and paintings. As visitors see the lifestyle of a bygone era, they hear the fascinating story of Belmont's mistress, Adelicia, Nashville's own Scarlett O'Hara,
who possessed intelligence, courage, strength, and the ability to overcome. I'm John Norris. Thanks for watching.
She also was known for charitable acts. In her funeral at First Presbyterian, the minister talked about all of her secret acts that but for a few none would know of, where she had done good in the community.
As I have known, as I expect a lot of people have, a few women who have that wonderful quality of making you feel like that you are absolutely the most important person they ever talk to, and that they just can't tear themselves away from you. And I think she had that gift.
There are stories of the children bringing back from Louisiana pet alligators and releasing the baby alligators in the lake, and one of them getting loose at one point on the Hillsborough Turnpike and causing quite a commotion with that giant lizard walking to town.